You check your savings account, you saved $10,000 through hard work. A year goes by, you check it again. It's $10,050. Your bank paid you 5% interest, but in that same year prices for gas, food, and rent went up 3%. Your $10,050 now buys what $9,750 bought last year. You didn't spend a dime, you did everything right, and you still lost 25% of your wealth. It feels like you were robbed, but you can't figure out who did it. It feels like a rounding error, a cost of doing business. What if it's not an accident? What if it's a deliberate, calculated government policy? This is financial repression. It's the quietest theft in history. And to understand what's happening to your money right now, we have to go back to 1945. After World War II, the United States was victorious. It was also bankrupt. The U.S. national debt had exploded. It wasn't just big, it was 119% of the entire nation's economic output, or GDP. For every dollar of value created in the U.S., the government owed $119. This level of debt had destroyed empires before, so the government had three options. 1. Officially default on its debt, tell its citizens and creditors they just wouldn't be paid. This is political and financial suicide. 2. Enforce crippling austerity. Cut every government program, hike taxes to 90%. This is also political suicide. Or 3. The secret option, find a way to pay back the debt with money that was worth less every single year. They chose option 3. They launched the most successful and silent heist in modern history. It was a two-part plan. Step 1 was to cap interest rates. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department worked together. They passed regulations like Regulation Q. This put a legal ceiling on the interest rates banks could offer you even as inflation started to rise. Your savings account was legally forbidden from keeping up for years. Inflation might be 4%, but your bank was only allowed to pay you 15%. You were losing 25% every single year, guaranteed by law. This wasn't a market outcome, it was a deliberate policy decision. Your loss was the government's gain. But here's where it gets interesting. Low rates weren't enough. The government needed a guaranteed customer for its new debt who would be foolish enough to buy a 2% bond when inflation was 4%. The answer is someone who has no choice. This was step 2. Capital controls. The government passed new rules for banks, pension funds, and insurance companies. These rules required them to hold a large percentage of their assets in U.S. government bonds. Think about that. Your pension fund, your insurance policy, they were legally forced to buy an asset that was guaranteed to lose money every year. This created a captive audience. The government could issue billions in new debt, and these institutions had to buy it whether they wanted to or not. This went on for 35 years. From 1945 all the way to 1980, it was the slow, steady, invisible transfer of wealth from an entire generation of savers. If your grandfather put $100 into a government bond in 1945, by 1980, that $100 bond would only have the purchasing power of $30. Where did the other 70% of that wealth go? It didn't just vanish, it was siphoned year by year to the government. It was used to pay down that impossible 119% debt. By 1974, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio had melted away. It fell from 119% down to just 32%. It wasn't an economic miracle, it was financial repression. It was a soft default paid for by every person holding cash, which brings us to today. It's 2025. And the numbers are back. The U.S. national debt just crossed $37 trillion. That's a number so large, it's meaningless. Let's make it real. That $37 trillion is 122% of U.S. GDP. We are right now in deeper debt than we were at the end of World War II. The same 1945 problem is back, and the same three options are on the table. Default. No austerity? Never. That only leaves option 3. The playbook is open, the game is starting again. But the new repression looks different. The 2008 financial crisis was the start. The U.S. government spent $700 billion on bailouts. The Federal Reserve created $12 trillion to buy toxic assets. The national debt exploded. So what did the Fed do? They pinned interest rates to the floor from December 2008 to December 2015. For 7 straight years, the official U.S. interest rate was 0%. Not 1% during that time. Inflation was low, but it was still positive. It averaged around 15%. Every single person holding U.S. dollars in a savings account was guaranteed to lose 15% of their purchasing power every year. This wasn't a secret, it was the entire point. And then everything changed after 2020. The government needed to fund trillions in new spending. The Federal Reserve printed $48 trillion. The national debt soared by 40% in just 3 years. This time inflation didn't stay quiet. It spiked first to 5%, then 7%, then 91% by June of 2022 for two full years, a saver with $10,000 in. The bank watched it become $9,000 in real terms, but the Fed's interest rate was still at 1%. This was the most aggressive financial repression in 75 years. You were being paid 1%, while your money was losing value at 91%. That is a negative 9% real return. It was a 9% tax, and you never got to vote on it. But this new repression created a monster in the 1940s capital. Controls forced money into bonds. Today there are fewer controls. So when you tell an entire generation of investors, you will be punished for saving, the money has to go somewhere. It can't stay in cash, so it fled. It poured into the stock market, pushing it to all-time highs. It poured into real estate, making housing unaffordable. It poured into cryptocurrencies, pegs of rocks, and trading cards. The everything bubble wasn't a sign of a strong economy. It was a rational response to a system that declared war on savers. It was a desperate search for a life raft. The policy forced savers to become speculators. So what happens next? The Fed had to raise rates in 2022. They had to fight the 9% inflation monster they had created. They hiked rates from 0% to 55% in 16 months, the fastest hike in 40 years. But this revealed the government's trap. The government itself is the world's biggest debtor. It now has to pay over 5% interest on its $37 trillion debt. The interest payments alone are scheduled to hit $1 trillion per year. That is $1 trillion. That single line item is now larger than the entire U.S. defense budget. It is larger than Medicare. It is completely, mathematically unsustainable. The system is breaking under the weight of its own debt. The government cannot afford 55% interest rates. The regional banks that were told to buy safe government bonds at 15% in 2021 are now insolvent. Their safe assets are down 40% in value. The government cannot default. It cannot cut spending. It must get interest rates back down, so the final move is inevitable, which brings us back to the 1945 playbook. The government needs inflation. It is the only way out. Here is the prediction. The Federal Reserve will be forced to cut rates, not because inflation is dead, but because the U.S. Treasury cannot afford the interest payments. They will let inflation run hot. They will tell you the new target is 3%, but they will use their power to cap bond yields at 15%. Or 2%, the difference between that 3% inflation and that 2% yield. It's a quiet 1% tax on every dollar you own. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not a secret plan hidden in a vault. It's just arithmetic. And it's the only path left. They will steal your wealth to save their system. So you are now left with two choices. Do you follow their plan? Do you become the speculator they want you to be, forced into risky stocks and real estate just to stay even? Or do you find hard assets outside the banking system that they cannot print and cannot control? Which strategy do you think is the real path to safety for the next 10 years? Drop your prediction in the comments below and subscribe.